You've probably heard arguments for gun control, but you might not have heard much about the history of gun control. It's a topic covered in a recent column at CarolinaJournal.com, authored by Ray Nothstine, opinion editor at Carolina Journal. You start this by talking about the interest in learning about the true or complete history of the United States, but we haven't heard a whole lot about the true history of gun control.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. You're right. We hear so much today in the media with headlines. We got to teach the true history. We got to teach the complete history in schools. You hear that on the left, sort of an accusation against we're not teaching about slavery, or we're not teaching fully about the civil rights movement or whatever, or just defense of critical race theory. But this is an important point because we're certainly not teaching any school that I went to that there's this racist legacy when it comes to gun control in the United States, and particularly in the American South, especially during the time, obviously, of slavery and the slave revolts, but also during the Jim Crow era, which is tied to North Carolina and the pistol permit law.
In fact, one of the reasons you wrote this column is that in late July, the ACLU sent out a tweet that suggested the Second Amendment was tied to racism, and you said, wait a minute, this is completely opposite of what is the truth.
Right, and there's been a lot of pile-on social media. There's been great scholars doing work on the racist history of gun control. Stephen Holbrook at the Independent Institute is one who's written quite a bit on this, but there's been others at different think tanks and even universities. But this, I think, is just an essential issue to really grapple with and understand because, like you said, if we're going to delve into the complete history of guns in America and gun control laws, then you have to look at the reasons that we have some of these laws. And a big reason was to prevent black citizens and Americans from having arms. I mean, there's a famous case that is cited by some of MLK, Martin Luther King's biographers, but when he was attacked, his house was firebombed during the Montgomery bus boycott. He filed in Alabama for a pistol permit, and of course it was not shall issue like North Carolina is now. It was a may issue state back then. Alabama's shall issue now, but he was denied, and obviously he was denied on the basis of race because there was no other reason to deny him.
You've already mentioned this, but going back to something else that's pointed out in your column, pistol permit laws that go back more than 100 years were directly tied to the desire to keep black North Carolinians from having access to firearms.
Right. If you trace the history of pistol permit laws, which every state in the Southeast has gotten rid of except for North Carolina, and Cooper defends this law. He doesn't go into the racial history of it, but he does defend it publicly, saying the sheriffs need to know, even though we have a universal federal background check. But if you go back and trace the history of this law, they all occurred kind of in the mid to late Jim Crow era, especially the turn of the century, all the way up to when North Carolina enacted it in 1917. You can kind of look through all those southern states that have segregation. Right around the same time are passing pistol permit laws. Why are they doing that? You have to ask that question. And it's clear, like I said before, is to keep black citizens from having a firearm that's a little bit maybe easier to conceal or carry or defend themselves with, which was the pistol.
And in fact, you don't mention this in the column, but it's certainly another piece of history that sounds like the pistol permit law in North Carolina came about around the same time that all of these controversial Civil War monuments went up from people who were trying to defend sort of racist policies that are now being attacked in terms of the monuments. That is another piece of the history.
Right, and I brought that up in writing about the pistol permit in the past, is that, look, I mean, this is kind of the heyday of the sort of, recognition of the Civil War, states' rights. And, there was a concerted effort with the Lost Cause movement. You had Civil War widows still and children who wanted to pay tribute to the fallen soldiers of the South. But you're right, there is sort of a connection there, just in this sort of indomitable kind of spirit of white supremacy that did exist in the South that you have to acknowledge, and I think you have to be honest about. And why were these pistol permit going up again? Why were they happening at the same time? I think that's an important question to ask.
You mentioned Martin Luther King. You focus on that particular incident in your column. You also mentioned another great African American from this nation's history, and Frederick Douglass. And he had a great line about needing to have access to a gun as well as other things to actually be a free person.
Yeah, this is an important point. The journalist, African-American Ida B. Wells, also wrote about this. She talks about blacks should have access to firearms like the Winchester rifle, which of course is kind of similar because it was a repeating rifle to maybe a home defense weapon someone might choose like an AR-15 today, because it was a repeating rifle, so you had a better chance of defending yourself with it. So of course Frederick Douglass believed that. It's kind of an interesting concept, an important point again to delve into, because the script has been flipped a little bit on the left, and by some black activists and black Americans that advocate for gun control, their legacy is actually for a more fuller understanding of the Second Amendment, right? I mean, that's an important part of their understanding of equality and freedom in this nation. And when that became interrupted by gun control laws, then they saw that as a threat. And so now you have some activists on the left, some who are African American, not all. I mean, black advocacy for the Second Amendment is really growing, but some who are now saying that there's this racist legacy. Of course, Carol Anderson, who's a professor at Emory University, has written a book on this about how the Second Amendment is inherently racist, and there's no evidence to that. I mean, the evidence, when you go back and read the founders, when you go back and read Madison and the Federalists, when they talk about the Second Amendment and the importance of it, has nothing to do with race. It has to do with the right being inherent and treating us differently than Europe, that the citizens are the master of government and not the other way around, like you had kind of in feudal Europe. So if you go back and read the actual text, this becomes clear. And the black activists, the black civil rights leaders of that era understood that. And so to see kind of the script flipped because for political reasons is interesting.
And it's also important to note that one of the reasons that Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson got to where he is because he was a staunch Second Amendment advocate and was talking about that in his first widely publicized speech. If you'd like to learn more, you can go to carolinajournal.com and find the column with the headline, "Gun Control's Racist Past is Finally Making Big Headlines." Its author is Ray Nothstine. He is opinion editor at Carolina Journal. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot.